Before we get into this story, if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Confessions. Hit that subscribe button because every week we bring you the kind of stories that make you think twice about the people you think you know. And drop a comment below. Tell us what city you're watching from. We love knowing where our community is tuning in from. Now, let's get into it. The night Cassandra Whitmore signed the papers. It was raining in Toronto the way it only rains in November. Sideways, relentless. The kind of cold that gets into your coat before you even step outside. Her husband didn't wait for her to read them. Just sign, Cass. Brendan set his glass down on the kitchen counter. Their kitchen counter. The one she'd picked out at a showroom on Queen Street West 3 years ago. Because she loved the way the stone caught morning light. We both know this is where it ends. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the fury he was expecting, not with tears. She looked at him the way you look at a weather forecast you'd already prepared for, acknowledging, practical, unmoved. Then she picked up the pen. What Brendan did not know, what he could not have known, because Cassandra had stopped telling him things that mattered approximately 14 months earlier, was that 48 hours from that moment, she was scheduled to walk into a meeting that would change the shape of the Canadian architecture industry for the next 2 decades. He thought he was ending a marriage. He had no idea he was stepping out of the frame right before the photograph was taken. Cassandra Whitmore had been designing buildings since she was 23 years old, when she graduated from the University of Toronto's Daniels faculty, in the language academics use when they are genuinely surprised, as structurally ambitious. She had started at a mid-sized firm in the financial district, drafting other people's ideas for 7 years before. She quietly left, took out a second mortgage on a condo in Leslieville, and opened her own practice out of a shared workspace on Gerrard Street. That was 10 years ago. Brendan had been there for all of it. He had watched her take the second mortgage. He had eaten dinner alone most nights that first year while she stayed at the office until midnight. He had smiled at parties when people asked what his wife did and said, "She runs her own architecture firm," with the particular brightness of a man who has decided his pride is sufficient substitute for actual interest. He never asked about the projects. Not once in 10 years did he sit across from her at a table and say, "Tell me what you're working on." He asked about billing. He asked about clients. He asked, occasionally, whether she thought the firm would ever be stable enough for them to talk about a house in Oakville. But the work itself, the months she'd spent studying passive house design, the research trips to Copenhagen and Vancouver, the obsessive way she'd rebuilt her firm's entire structural methodology around sustainable materials. After a conference in Winnipeg had changed how she thought about Canadian climate architecture. None of that had ever made it into a conversation between them. She had stopped trying to bring it up somewhere around year 4. By year 8, she had simply accepted that there were 2 versions of her life. The one she built every day at the studio on Gerrard Street, and the one she performed every evening when she came home to Brendan. The problem, she understood eventually, was that only one of those versions was real. The project that Brendan never knew about was called the Meridian Collective. It had started as a proposal, an unsolicited one, which in the architecture of cold calling a hedda edifskat, submitted to a federally backed urban development estate. Submitted to a federally backed urban development initiative, MIN6, mid-of-claim Canadian cities. See as fee. The initiative was called the Northern Livability Project, funded through a combination of federal infrastructure money and private investment, and it had attracted proposals from some of the largest firms in the country. Cassandra had submitted hers from a laptop in her studio at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. She had been working on the Meridian Collective for 2 years by then. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because there was a client waiting. She had built it the way she built everything that actually mattered to her. Quietly, methodically, on her own time, because she believed in it. The proposal reimagined how Canadians in smaller cities lived through winter, not just insulation values and heating costs. The technical language developers used when they wanted to sound thoughtful without being genuinely innovative. But the actual human experience of winter in a northern country. connected covered walkways between residential and commercial spaces, shared thermal infrastructure that reduced heating costs by embedding community spaces as heat sinks, roof lines designed to manage snow load while creating usable outdoor terraces, 3 seasons a year instead of 1, building orientations that maximized natural light in January in cities where light is a resource as precious as anything else. It was the most ambitious thing she had ever designed. When the Northern Livability Project's review panel wrote back 6 weeks after submission to say they wanted a meeting, Cassandra was standing in the parking lot of a Shoppers Drug Deal buying cold medicine. She read the email 3 times before she walked back to her car. Then she sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. She did not call Brendan. She called her project manager, a young woman named Tess, who had been with the firm for 3 years and who was, in Cassandra's estimation, the most organized human being she had ever encountered. She said, "We got the meeting. Clear my calendar for the next 6 weeks." Tess said, "Already on it. Here is the thing about a marriage that has been deteriorating for years. There is rarely a single moment that ends it. There is instead a long series of small moments, a conversation that doesn't happen, an evening where you sit in the same room and feel further from each other than geography could account for, a question you stop asking because you already know the shape of the non-answer. And these moments accumulate the way sediment accumulates, slowly, until one day you realize the ground beneath your feet has changed entirely and you cannot remember when the shift began." For Cassandra, the moment she traced it back to was a dinner party in Rosedale. A colleague of Brendan's had invited them, along with 6 other couples, and over the course of the evening the conversation had turned, as it often did in that particular social circle, to money. Not in the way people who have earned money talk about it. In the way people who married money or work adjacent to it talk about it as a proxy for seriousness, for relevance, for the question of whether your life counts. Brendan's colleague, a man named Peter whose opinions arrived with the confidence of a person who has never been seriously contradicted, had said something about the architecture industry, about how residential development was where the real money was, about how the artistic stuff, his words, was all well and good, but if you weren't building condos, you weren't building a real business. Cassandra had started to respond. Brendan had talked over her, not aggressively, not obviously. He had simply begun a sentence that assumed she had finished hers, and the table had followed his lead, and by the time she registered what had happened, the moment was gone, and Peter was talking about square footage in Yorkville. She had looked at Brendan across the table. He was laughing at something Peter said. She picked up her wine glass and said nothing. That was 4 years before the divorce papers. Me? But that was, she understood later, the night she started building the second life in earnest. Not consciously, not as a plan, but because something in her had registered with a clarity that emotional noise often obscures, that she was alone inside this marriage, and had been for some time. She might as well build something with the solitude. The review panel met in a boardroom on the 41st floor of a tower on Bay Street, with a view north that on a clear day stretched past the city's edge into the greenbelt beyond. There were 9 people around the table. Private investment representatives, a consultant from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and at the far end the panel's chair, a woman named Vivian Osei, who had spent 30 years in urban planning and whose reputation in the industry was such that architects twice Cassandra's age referred to her simply as the standard. Cassandra had done her homework on every person in that room. She set her materials on the table, made eye contact with each person once before she began, and then she spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She spoke about winter, about what it does to people in northern cities, about the public health data on seasonal depression, about the economic cost of communities that go socially dormant between November and April, about what it would mean to design not around winter, but with it. She spoke about the specific thermal and structural systems she had developed and why they worked in Canadian climate conditions, in a way that imported European models didn't. She answered questions from the investment representatives about cost projections without deflecting. She walked Dr. Osei through the load-bearing adaptations for prairie soil conditions when asked without pausing to gather herself. When it was over, Dr. Osei looked at her for a moment and said, "Ms. Whitmore, we've seen 47 proposals. I want you to know that yours is the first one that made me feel like the person submitting it had actually spent a winter in Canada." Cassandra said, "I've spent 41 of them." There was a beat. Then the room laughed. The real kind. The kind that isn't polite but surprised. The meeting ended. The panel needed 2 more weeks for internal review. Cassandra took the elevator down 41 floors, walked out onto Bay Street into November wind, and found a bench near the corner of King. She sat there for a while. The city moved around her. Suits and coffee cups, and the particular Toronto rush of a Wednesday at noon. And she thought about the dinner party in Rosedale, and Peter's opinion about the artistic stuff, and Brendan's laugh, and the way a room full of serious people had just spent 40 minutes listening to her without once checking their phones. She didn't cry. That's worth saying, because people often expect that part of the story. She didn't cry because what she felt was not grief. It was something quieter and more durable than grief. It was recognition. She had known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was coming. Not the meeting specifically, but the arrival. The moment when all the years of working in the dark would resolve into something visible. She had been building toward this her whole career. Brendan had been in the building, but he had never been part of the construction. He called on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the papers were signed, to ask about the shared savings account. Cassandra was in the studio. Tess had just forwarded her an email from the Northern Livability Project's legal team with the subject line, "Contract Documentation, Meridian Collective, Phase 1. She looked at the email. She looked at her phone. She answered. "I need to know how we're handling the joint account," Brendan said. No preamble, which was at least honest. "I've talked to my lawyer and he says," "Brendan, we should divide it before the end of the fiscal, Brendan." Her voice was even. It had been even since the kitchen, since the rain, since the pen. She decided that, a long time ago, that she was not going to be the person who raised her voice over any of this. "Take what's in there, all of it." Silence. "I don't want it back," she said. "I'm not going to contest it. You can have the account. Tell your lawyer it's settled." He stopped. Started again. "Why?" She looked at the email from the legal team, at the subject line, at the figure in the contract summary she'd spent half the afternoon reviewing. "Because it doesn't matter," she said. She wasn't being generous. She wasn't being strategic, not in the way people sometimes are when they make a sacrifice and then wait for credit. She was being accurate. The balance in their joint account, a number Brendan had watched with the attention of a person who measures safety and savings, was not going to matter to her next year or the year after. He wouldn't understand that yet. She didn't explain it. "Okay," he said. And then, after a pause, "That's very..." He seemed to be looking for the word. Mature, maybe. Generous. Some word that would let him feel like he was receiving a gift rather than being released. "Goodbye, Brendan," she said. She ended the call and went back to the contract. The Northern Livability Project announced its selected proposals on a Friday in February at a press conference held at a heritage building near Ottawa's Byward Market that had been renovated according to sustainable building principles, which Cassandra found appropriate. The Meridian Collective was named the primary housing framework for the initiative's first phase. 6 cities. Federal funding, a private investment total that, when the partnership agreements were finalized over the following months, came to $340 million, with options for expansion in the second phase that brought the full commitment, pending performance, to $680 million. The press release described it as a generational shift in how Canadian cities approach northern living. The Globe and Mail ran a piece, then the Toronto Star, then a profile in Azure, as the architecture magazine Cassandra had been reading since she was a student, which had once published a brief mention practices, and which now ran 4 pages on the Meridian Collective with photographs of her standing in the Leslieville studio in front of a wall of drawings she'd been accumulating for 2 years. She looked at the photographs when the issue arrived. She sat with it in the studio, on a Saturday morning with coffee, the way she'd always imagined sitting with something like this, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she set it on her desk and went back to work. The call from Brendan came on a Tuesday. She hadn't heard from him in 3 months. Not since the joint account conversation, not since the papers had been processed, and the marriage had become, legally and practically, a closed file. She was in a site meeting in Hamilton. When his name appeared on her screen, she let it go to voicemail. She listened to the message that evening. He'd seen the Globe piece, he said. He'd had no idea, that phrase, precisely, had no idea about the scale of what she'd been working on. He said something about being proud of her, which landed strangely, the way compliments do when they come from people who weren't present for the work. He said he'd been talking to a financial advisor. Then he said carefully the thing she had known was coming, since she read about the Meridian Collective in a national newspaper. He wanted to discuss whether the project had originated during the marriage, and whether that had any implications for. She stopped the message. She sat with her phone in her hand for a moment. Then she called her lawyer. Her lawyer, a woman named Christine who had been practicing family law in Toronto for 22 years, and who had the specific patience of someone who has heard every variation of human optimism collide with reality, listened and then said, the Meridian Collective proposal was submitted 6 weeks. The contract was executed after. The firm is solely yours. He has no claim. That's what I thought, Cassandra said. Do you want me to send a letter? Please. Anything you want it to say specifically. Cassandra thought about it. About the dinner party. About Peter. About Brendan's laugh. About 41 winters in a boardroom on the 41st floor, and Dr. Vivian Osei saying, I feel like the person submitting it has actually spent a winter in Canada. Just the facts, she said. He doesn't need anything else from me. She did not want to talk about Brendan's response after that, because Brendan's response in the end was not the story. That had always been her instinct, and the years had confirmed it. You are rarely the interesting part. What they do, what they take, what they think they're entitled to, that's all noise. Background weather. The interesting part is what you build while the weather is happening. What Cassandra built in the years that followed changed how a significant portion of Canadians in 6 cities experienced the coldest months of a year. The first Meridian Collective development opened in Saskatoon in late autumn, a year and a half after the contract was signed. She flew out for the opening. She stood in the covered walkway that connected the residential building to the community hub and watched a family. 2 parents, a child in a snowsuit, a grandmother moving slowly with a walker, make their way from their apartment to the community kitchen without once stepping into the cold. She had argued for it in a meeting where 3 separate advisors had suggested. It was an unnecessary cost. She had held the line until it was in the plan. She watched the family. The grandmother was saying something to the child that Cassandra couldn't hear from where she stood. The child looked up at the skylight above the walkway. A triple glazed roof light she'd specified because winter light is worth protecting, and said something back. Cassandra didn't have children. She and Brendan had talked about it in the early years, and then stopped talking about it, the way you stop talking about things that require 2 people to agree. She thought about that sometimes, not with the grief she might have expected, but with a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of how things go. She watched the grandmother and the child, and she thought about evenings in the studio, and the proposal submitted from a laptop on Jared Street, and the meeting on the 41st floor, where she'd spoken for 40 minutes without notes. She thought, this is what that was for, not revenge. Not the headline, not $680 million. Though she should be lying if she said the number didn't mean something. It meant, specifically, that she would never again have to think about a savings account balance as a measure of her security, which was a kind of freedom she had not previously understood how much she wanted. But that wasn't the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered was a covered walkway in Saskatoon in November, a child looking up at winter light through glass, a grandmother who did not have to go out into the cold. That was what she had built. That was what the years of working in the dark had been building toward. Not proving something to Brendan, not correcting Peter's opinion at a dinner party in Rosedale. She had long since stopped needing either of. The work had never been about that. It had only ever been about what it felt like to design something true, something that acknowledged the specific reality of living in a northern country through its worst season, and to see that design exist in the world. The rest of it. The signing the rain. The phone call in the studio. The voicemail she stopped before it finished. That was just the weather. She had never been afraid of weather. She zipped her coat, pushed open the door at the end of the walkway, and stepped outside into a Saskatchewan cold. It was sharp and immediate and clarifying. The way cold in this country always is. She stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, watching her breath cloud and dissolve in the air. Then she walked back to her hotel to prepare for the next morning's meeting. There were 5 more cities to build.